Thanks for inviting me to this very timely meeting. Timely because of the menacing threat of the far right internationally. Timely also because of misconceptions floating around, especially on social media, that misread the nature of the far right threat with disturbing results, such as left-wingers reposting tweets by the neo-Nazi former BNP leader, Nick Griffin, who knows how to veil his anti-Semitism in pro-Palestine statements. Others claiming that the far-right poster boy, Tommy Robinson, is simply a servant of Israel. We need better analysis. The far right in 2020's Britain is bigger and broader than Tommy Robinson and Nick Griffin. It's the latest iteration of an unbroken chain of anti-democratic, ultra-nationalist and racist ideology and practice defending the capitalist order that started with the British fascisti, formed by upper-class conservatives who admired Mussolini's Italy in 1923. British fascism has emerged under various names, among groups that sometimes regard each other as rivals, but share core beliefs. Both Nick Griffin and Tommy Robinson fit comfortably within that unbroken chain. In Robinson's case, for more than 20 years, in Griffin's case, more than 40 years. When Oswald Mosley launched the British Union of Fascists in 1932, he attempted to unite disparate far-right factions, but Arnold Leese's Imperial Fascist League stayed outside. They claimed that Mosley was himself a Jew and denounced Mosley's movement as kosher fascists. In 1935, the Imperial Fascist League's newspaper said there was one way to deal with the country's, quote, Jewish problem, through a lethal chamber. That was years before Hitler adopted that view. Between different generations of fascists, there's a crossover of personnel as well as ideology. When the National Front was created in 1967, its first chair was A.K. Chesterton, GK's cousin. A.K. spent the 1930s in the British Union of Fascists, and in the period after World War II in small anti-Semitic organisations obsessed with Jewish conspiracies. Several early members of the National Front spent their youth in Mosley's movement. The 1970s National Front concentrated its street propaganda and physical attacks against Asian and Caribbean communities, while training their inner core to believe that immigration was a Jewish conspiracy to dilute the white race. On Sunday mornings from 1976 to 1980, where Brick Lane met Bethnal Green Road in East London, the National Front sold papers, abused Bengali immigrants, and had a bookstall with anti-immigrant literature where you could also purchase Did 6 Million Really Die and other Holocaust denial books. They deliberately parked their stall outside a shop run by a Jewish couple. A smaller, more openly Nazi group, the British Movement, active in London and Liverpool, specialised in anti-Semitic stickers, one of which said, "Communism is Jewish." A friend of mine and I debated, should we remove them or should we write underneath, let's keep it that way. The National Front's newspapers made no distinction then between South Asian groups. They abused brown-skinned immigrants, whether they were Hindu, Sikh or Muslim, and didn't refer to which category. In the mid-80s, though, Nick Griffin, a rising National Front figure, made contact with members here of Louis Farrakhan's Nation of Islam and built a relationship with Gaddafi in Libya. It wasn't until the late 1990s, and especially after 9/11, that a specifically anti-Muslim racism emerged among the far right here. The fascist 1970s explanation of the threat to white supremacy has morphed in the 21st century into the Great Replacement theory, whereby Muslims replace white Christians in the West, while Jews encourage and fund this replacement. It's got more complicated now, though, because many, but far from all far-right groups in the world, or even in Britain, embrace Israel as a model anti-Islam, ethno-nationalist, racist state with self-described fascists in its government. Early 1980s, the National Front split, and the BNP, led by old-school Nazi John Tyndall, emerged as the larger faction. After 9/11, younger BNP members saw a golden opportunity to push harder on specifically anti-Muslim racism. But Tyndall and older hardline BNP members welcomed 9/11 as an attack by Muslims on the evil empire of the USA, as they saw it, a world power run by and for Jews. And that fault line still exists among fascists today. The recent racist pogroms here were not organized simply by Tommy Robinson, who likes to be photographed draped in an Israeli flag. One of several fascist groups involved that Suresh mentioned, Patriotic Alternative, led by Yorkshire-based Mark Collett, who considers international Jews the main enemy. Collett has been an openly Nazi agitator for nearly 25 years. Yet a few months ago, a pro-Palestine video interviewing him, produced by the Islamic Five Pillars group, was circulating among Palestine solidarity groups, including one I'm signed up to. I helped get it removed. Several years before Robinson created Pegida UK, then the EDL, which centered Islamophobia, and he made himself the figurehead of both, he had joined the neo-Nazi BNP. In a recent CNN interview, he moved beyond that crude Islamophobia to denounce mass immigration in general as a threat to Britain, encouraged, he says, by George Soros-funded leftist groups, pointing the finger at a Hungarian Jewish financier. What's the relationship of the far right with mainstream politics? Over the decades, the inadequacies of responses by mainstream political parties to crises of capitalism have given oxygen to the far right. Tory austerity is about to be replaced by Labour austerity. Austerity is the incubator of fascism. Struggling people with falling living standards become prey to those who scapegoat minorities rather than the economic system that protects the rich. In addition, though, mainstream politicians have normalized some far-right racist and ethno-nationalist ideas. Both Conservative and Labour leaders will assure you that they oppose the far right, but they do so only by adapting to those far-right ideas. Before I provide specific examples from Labour, I want to return to the 30s because poor analyses then are still present today. While the Daily Mail became infatuated with Mosley, especially around 1934, its love of Hitler lasted right until the end of the decade. But the more orthodox conservative paper, The Times, attacked communists and fascists alike for, quote, preaching political creeds which have in common their alien origin. To them, any Nazi-style rhetoric in Britain was simply imported from Germany. Its coupling of alien with communism was not just a reference to Russia. They also meant the you-know-whos. The Times effectively denied that fascism and crude anti-Semitism could grow organically in Britain, or that British people suffering mass unemployment and poverty might be attracted to communist solutions of their own volition. The belief that fascism and anti-Semitism here were foreign imports was repeated by prominent Labour MPs at that time, who imbibed the ruling class's handy idea that Britain was a country of decency and fair play, rather than exploitation. The denial that anti-Semitism and fascism could be homegrown in Britain was shared by the Board of Deputies. Today, in a very crowded field of simplistic analyses of the recent far-right organised racist and anti-refugee pogroms in Britain, the right-wing press and centrist politicians still deny the extent of homegrown racism, blaming Russian influence instead. Equally in denial, though, are those purporting to be leftists who tell us Israel pushed the riot button in Britain and that Israel decided to burn down Britain, as if racists in Britain needed lessons in Islamophobia or anti-refugee sentiment from Israel. British people have been fed a daily diet of racism in their media for decades, especially after 9/11, rampant Islamophobia, fear and hatred of asylum seekers. Both Tory and Labour leaders proclaimed, stop the boats. Both parties have mainstreamed Islamophobia through the prevent strategy. It was only when Corbyn was party leader there was any pushback on this in Labour. The collusion among mainstream parties has precedence. When Mosley's party brought violence and threats against Jews to a crescendo in October 1936 threatening to march through the East End's most heavily Jewish populated streets. Grassroots Labour members and trade unionists wanted to confront them, but Labour's hierarchy joined Liberals and Tories to denounce plans for a counter-demonstration. The Board of Deputies made the same call. Thankfully, Jews completely ignored them, a habit we should definitely revive. After Mosley's fascists, protected by 7,000 police, were stopped through the mass presence of anti-fascists and rioting on the streets, the Tory-dominated national government brought in the Public Order Act. It banned political uniforms and granted the police much stronger powers on demonstrations. The National Council for Civil Liberties opposed this act, as did a significant grassroots anti-fascist Jewish group in the East End, the Jewish People's Council Against Fascism and Anti-Semitism. They warned that increased police powers would actually fulfill some fascist demands and ultimately be used more against the left than the right. The Jewish People's Council said, we don't need a Public Order Act. We need a law on racial incitement. And they were 40 years ahead of their time. Labour voted for the Public Order Act, having largely failed to amend it. But they did get the Tories to withdraw a clause giving police powers to ban flags and provocative placards on demonstrations. Can anyone imagine Starmer-led Labour doing anything to reduce police powers, especially on pro-Palestine demonstrations? Another lesson from the 1930s. I've been struck by the strong desire today to find one single explanation of our 2024 pogroms. One identifiable puppet master pulling the strings. I've had to remind comrades in my local anti-racist WhatsApp group that the roots of fascism are not in one people, one ethnicity, one individual, but are in systems produced by economic and political circumstances, capitalism in crisis, that utilize ultranationalism and seek dictatorship. 1930s fascism was not simply down to Hitler or Mussolini. Fascism arose independently in Austria, Belgium, France, Croatia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and of course in Spain. Right now, the countries moving in fascistic directions where far-right ideologues are growing in confidence certainly include Israel, India, Italy, France, Germany, and Austria. Check the latest Austrian results. But we lose rather than gain our focus if we think there is one driver, one puppet master. So what has Labour done about racism? In 1965, 68 and 76, they brought in race relations legislation, a genuine effort by certain principled Labour MPs to challenge the most overt racism and discrimination in society. But in that same period, Labour's hierarchy engaged in a bidding war with the Tories over ever harsher immigration laws. Labour opposed the Tories' racist immigration laws in 62, but brought in its own harsh laws when in government. The next Tory government went further, then Labour further still. Key Labour ministers in that period insisted that good race relations required firm immigration control, effectively a system that stigmatized migrants as a problem. The negative focus on immigration paved the way for the National Front to push still harsher demands around immigration, and they were boosted a year after forming when Tory Enoch Powell called on Tory Shadow Cabinet Minister Enoch Powell called on Britain to stop immigration and start repatriation. I was a Labour Party member for a few years in the 1980s, first in Newham, East London, then in Camden, North London. While canvassing for left-winger Tony Banks in Newham in 1983, the lack of anti-racist education by Labour was ever present on the doorstep. Many householders assured us they would definitely vote Labour, and then added, but I wish you'd do something about the immigrants, and they didn't mean help them. My first Labour Party ward meeting in Camden, mid-1980s, resembled a lynch mob. Their target, a few families of travellers who parked their caravans on a space empty for many years. When somebody
David, 5 minutes max.
Sorry?
5 minutes max.
5 minutes, yeah, okay. When somebody hinted about racism, the chair said, I can't be racist, I'm Irish. After the meeting, we had a drink with the one black person in the meeting. She had looked as shocked and staggered by us at the open racism displayed. And yet, for a brief period from 81 to 86, A progressive light flickered in London against racism, for multiculturalism, for action on women's equality and LGBT equality. The left-dominated GLC promoted progressive ideas, funded grassroots equality initiatives. Thatcher snuffed it out to the relief of Labour's grandees. Let's go to Barking and Dagenham, solid Labour area, but neglected especially by one of its two MPs, Margaret Hodge. Elected in 1994, she never lived there and had no office there until 2006, when 12 BNP members were suddenly elected to the council in her constituency, 3 in John Craddock's neighbouring one. The BNP only contested 13 seats. BNP voters were mainly switches from Labour. After Hodge opened an office there, she tried to address the situation by proposing a racist, anti-migrant, anti-refugee housing policy locally. Even fellow right-wingers in Labour denounced her for, quote, speaking the language of the BNP. The BNP turned up at her office with a bunch of flowers, but she wasn't there. Right now, the major focus of many anti-racists and anti-fascists is Tommy Robinson, an irritant, a chancer, an opportunist, but capable of whipping up hatred and violence, attracting thousands to street protests. He is exploiting a perfect storm. Anger about asylum seekers arriving on boats, egged on by the right-wing media and politicians, Tory and Labour. Widespread dissatisfaction and alienation from political establishment. Low turnout in the general election. A Labour landslide, 64% of the seats, 33% of the vote. Nigel Farage's reform got more than 4 million votes and 5 seats. And they received 500,000 more votes than Lib Dems, who got 72. The seat Farage won in Clacton was gifted them by Labour's hierarchy when they pulled a very popular local black candidate away from the constituency to work elsewhere. Robinson and friends also benefited from the media and hard-right politicians playing to the racist gallery over Palestine marches, calling them hate marches led by jihadi and Hamas supporters. In steps Robinson, saying he will defend Jews and Muslims from Muslims and other anti-Semites, and arguing his work is being undermined by two-tier policing. Robinson feeds off the situation in Palestine, Israel, Gaza, the West Bank to exacerbate communal tensions. Meanwhile, both Islamophobic incidents and anti-Semitic incidents are growing. Robinson and Farage feed off each other and are gaining confidence and strength from the increasing popularity of the far right across Europe. Meanwhile, the political cowards who speak for the Jewish community cry crocodile tears about the far right elsewhere, but feed the same Islamophobic narratives that help Farage and Robinson. The vibrant anti-war protest movement in Britain is extraordinary, given all the hostility. And I'm especially proud of the role the Jewish bloc has played in giving and receiving genuine solidarity, standing for justice and truth, challenging bias in the media narratives. From the political establishment and far right, affirming that we as Jews stand against racism, fascism, and war everywhere. I want to finish with a quote from Solly Kay, a Jewish communist councillor in Tower Hamlets, speaking at a community meeting after Tosia Ali was the first victim of a racist murder there that decade. And this is what he said: the purveyors of racialism can be defeated by united action, but it would be the greatest error and worse if the struggle were left to the immigrant organizations to bear the brunt of that fight. The fight against racial discrimination and violence is part of the fight for a new and better society. Thank you.